Christopher, it's great to be back here in Bethlehem. I was here in May, and here, beautiful autumn colours. It's fabulous to be back.
You are getting the best seasons that Bethlehem has to offer. So, Malcolm, it's a pleasure to have you back. I'm Christopher Jackson, this is Malcolm Bruno, and we have teamed up to present Mendelssohn's St. Matthew Passion. But we met quite a while ago, actually, and you have ties to the Bach Choir of Bethlehem. And I was wondering if you might talk to us a little bit about how you came to know our organization and why this partnership took shape the way it did.
Yeah, well, those are two little points there. But the first is that I grew up in New Jersey many years ago, like 40 years ago, and then went to Britain. But when I grew up in New Jersey, the Bach choir was something that was always talked about at Bethlehem. There weren't too many Bach choirs around. There were no other Bach choirs around, actually. And Bach was in a very different part of the landscape in the 1960s than it is today. Yeah. There weren't any period instrument groups. Many of the Bach ensembles that are now in America didn't exist. So this was a very important anchor of Bach in America. But I have to say, I never got to hear a performance until the spring when I came to the B minor, which was fabulous.
And now you are more thoroughly tied to the organization through this recording and this performance.
Which looking forward to, of course, immensely.
Yeah, but you and I had met actually in the past. We found this through discussion at one point, and you also have worked with our executive director, Lila Breithaupt, in the past as well.
Yes.
So Malcolm and I met on a recording project with Westminster Choir College.
Trying to remember which year, but maybe we don't want to reveal that.
Yeah, exactly. But and then you had similarly worked with Lila Breithaupt before.
I've worked with the Indy Baroque, as they call it, Indianapolis Baroque, for about 10 years now, and Lila is a fabulous Baroque flautist, if you didn't know that. And she was then in an administrative position with the orchestra, so I got to know her extremely well. And she was instrumental in bringing Bartold Koikin to Indianapolis to be artistic director of the orchestra, and it's been a great joy to do those projects. So I got to know Lila and Fritz, her husband, and the family, staying with them. And when she told me that she was looking at the Bethlehem Bach Festival, I said, what a fabulous idea. Time to leave Indianapolis, time to leave Bloomington, come to Bethlehem. And I was so delighted when she got the job.
Well, I'm glad that you're so persuasive and helped get Lila here. What, in your mind, made the Bach Choir of Bethlehem a good choice for this project?
Well, that's a really good question. My background is, although I grew up as a child in the Romantic Bach tradition, I then went to London to Royal College of Music to study as a composer. And when I left the Royal College, what does a composer do? I was interested in recording and production, and I walked in by a coincidence to a very interesting position with the Taverner Choir and Consort, Andrew Parrott, at the time when the whole Baroque movement, this is in the 80s, late in the 80s and 90s, when the whole Baroque movement was taking off, especially in London and Holland. Yeah. Largely funded by recording companies. And I hadn't really thought about this, and it was a very interesting job. I was associate director because I was a musician involved in the production of recordings and concert touring and so forth. But I was also doing other things at the same time. But when Bach, then Joshua Rifkin, we're going to meet in a symposium tomorrow, Joshua and Andrew were working very much on the idea of Bach as chamber music. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of resistance to it. I was sitting in the background listening to this. And then came a performance of the B minor Mass. and in Bach Ansbach in Germany, and we had 3 consorts of 5 singers, not a choir. There were 15 singers, but they were separated as if Renaissance ensemble. So there was the orchestra, and behind we had one consort on the left hand of the conductor, and one on the right, and one behind the orchestra. And of course, the orchestra is small too, 3-3-2-2-1, Bach size. So 20 people and 15 singers. And the groups of the singers, aside from the opening Kyrie and the Dona Nobis Pacem at the end, always either consort 1 or consort 2, or those 2 together. So they didn't ever sing together, so it was huge chamber music. And I heard this, and it was amazing. It was like hearing a Beethoven string quartet. It's very vital. And when you divide singers, when you put singers together, they sing as an ensemble. When you put them into separate groups, it's chamber music, because I'm not blending with another bass. You are the bass. If you stop singing, the line disappears. Yeah. So what you're concentrating on is the chamber music with the tenor and the alto and soprano and so forth. And suddenly I became interested in this, because it was a compositional question. It wasn't what I thought dusty music history, which was boring. It was, wow, I didn't understand this music. Now look at this. This is, like contemporary music. It's dangerous, it's difficult, and it's amazing.
And funny enough, these are the recordings that I actually grew up on when I began my musical studies and fell in love with Bach. Were a lot of these very same recordings with Andrew Parrott, Joshua Rifkin, and you were so heavily involved with their work.
Yeah, so. But by accident.
Yeah.
But then I became drawn into it, and they were very heated. I was telling Leela, I remember it was either Regensburg in Germany or Ansbach, in a Bierstube after the concert. And Joshua Rifkin was on one side of the room, Andrew was floating around somewhere, and Ton Koopman was on the other side. And there was this huge heated argument about, how many singers to have and how this should happen. And I remember the promoter of the festival came to me, Hans-Georg Schäfer, was very interesting. He had been von Karajan's intendant in Berlin, and he was now running this Bach festival, so of course he was somebody who knew things. He said, I love this. This is the kind of way to have a festival. You can feel the tension in the air.
Because of the argument.
Because of the dispute about Bach. Yeah. And he had both things programmed in the festival.
Yeah.
So, that's my background. And so that's fine. So I was intensely involved with this kind of performance. But the thing about Bach is, like Shakespeare, you know that there's something eternal in the music it's not because there are plenty of composers, Baroque composers, and if you take them out of the Baroque, the music collapses. If you take Bach out of the Baroque and you give it to Glenn Gould, it still works.
Still
and if you give a 2-part invention to a saxophone, and 2 wind instruments, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So there is always that thought with Bach. I ran a little symposium at Oxford for Choir and Organ magazine. I said, let's have a symposium to discuss not the argument of the 1-2 apart during Bach's lifetime, but what happened between 1750, when Bach died, and 1829, when Mendelssohn did this famous rediscovery of Bach, because Bach's music had disappeared from the public domain, as it were. Yeah. So what happened? How do you get from 1750 to 1829? And it was a very interesting round table. And it basically, what the round table was revealing is that society was changing. And that what was perceived in Germany as an elitist Italian cantata style of Bach's cantatas didn't have a place in society as it was opening up.
Yeah.
The music was too complicated and too elitist. And one of his successors said that Bach's music was ängstlich, anxiety-producing.
Yeah.
And the fugues were anxiety-producing and had no place in Lutheran worship. Can you imagine? This is his student who writes, who writes to the town council and says, we can't have this music. We have to have lovely, flowing, peaceful music.
Yeah, it's fascinating how in music history things ebb and flow. So the terrifying complexity sometimes of Bach's music was not where Germany at large wanted to go at that moment, or really European
or
music.
Anywhere.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. And then you get things like Mozart, which you can hear a clarity to the music and a relative simplicity.
Correct.
Although Mozart's such a funny example because later in his life he started looking backwards towards Baroque music as inspiration. But what you say about society changing reminds me a lot about the roots of the Bach Choir of Bethlehem. I mean, all accounts that I've read thought that undertaking a performance of the B minor Mass was one of the most difficult things to be done.
but it still is.
Exactly. No, it's not to take away from its difficulty even now, but it prevented many civic choirs, volunteer choirs, from even beginning to take this project on. And that's one of the things that's really unique about the Bach Choir of Bethlehem is we had this core group of personalities here in this town that managed to drum up the support for the year that it took to learn this music and to give it its first public performance here in the United States. So maybe I could pivot to a different question now and ask to give a very quick summary of how this Mendelssohn performance, reconstruction, rediscovery came to be, and also why the Bach Choir of Bethlehem may be the right performing force
Yes.
for our new performance.
Two very good, very important and related questions. So, scrolling back to Mendelssohn, born in 1809, a real genius, in ways more so than Mozart as a child, an extraordinary mind and very different world that Mendelssohn is in. Mozart's father, of course, is ambitious and musical person in his own right. Mendelssohn's father is a wealthy Jewish banker from as aristocratic as a Jewish family could be in Europe, the top end of society. So anything is affordable.
Right.
And so Mendelssohn grows up in this elitist world, but not unpleasant elitist, but just very privileged. Mm-hmm. So he can go and study. He is taken to this Sing Academy in Berlin. Carl Friedrich Zelter, head of it, very interesting character himself. And of course Mendelssohn's father is a benefactor to it. So, and in this, again, part of this spread of music to a wider audience.
Yes.
It's not a church choir. It is a town run with benefactors. Anyway, Zelter is very interested in Bach's music. He'd trained as a mason in architecture, so no surprise that he'd be interested in Bach's music.
Yeah.
But no one has heard this music except to try to play some keyboard, and it's conceived like the inventions really as a way of teaching composition and musical structure.
He'd been, put in textbooks essentially, would be a modern way of saying it, is now you study this learn how to write music.
This is counterpoint exercise.
Exactly, but we didn't know, or in the early 1800s, he wasn't known.
His music had not been heard
Yeah.
publicly since 1750.
Yeah.
Full stop. So Mendelssohn's looking at this and thinking, I'd love to hear this. Not a keyboard piece,
Right.
but choral music. Because what do you have with Bach? You have cantatas, you have big organ music, instrumental music, which was probably a smaller part in Bach's life than we experience now. And the Passions, of course, the huge pieces. And what does, so Mendelssohn, aged 13, 14, says, I would like to have a copy of the Matthew Passion. It's not published. Music is not published. So there is a score in the Sing Academy. I don't know whether it was his father or somebody who's, commissioned the score from a set of parts. So someone then has to copy the score again. His grandmother, Mendelssohn's grandmother, says, what would you like for your birthday? He says, I'd like a copy of the Matthew Passion, please. Okay, I'll get the concertmaster to copy the whole thing out, 300 pages of copying. And it's an amazing edition. So this is what has survived. Mendelssohn got this, aged 14, and is looking at it in this very productive period that has the early string symphonies in it, the famous octet, which is an amazing piece, Midsummer Night's Dream Overture, and indeed, by the way, an amazing Magnificat with Carl Philipp Emanuel's and Bach's Magnificat on the desk. And if you hear Carl Philipp Emanuel's Magnificat, which I recently a wonderful new recording come out, you see where Mendelssohn, and that's Mendelssohn 1824 when he's 15. So by the time he's 19, he says to Zelter, I want to do this, let's mount a performance. And Zelter, well, right, how are we going to do this? So they mount this performance with what in German is called Dilettanten, I love that word, amateur singers. And the forces are in the hundreds, I remember off the top of my head, but 360 something, and the orchestra huge too. And there's all the record of the rehearsing and same story, how difficult the music is. And what the performance was like was probably pretty rough.
We always make these assumptions that, based on the quality of the recordings and the performances that we hear now, it's impossible for us to know what the performing quality was actually like at that point. But are there accounts of it being...
Yes, there are accounts of the many struggles. And I think, in a way, there were a couple more performances that Zelter did. I think there were 2 performances that Mendelssohn did, 2 or 3 right then in Berlin, and then his teacher did more performances. But he died in the 1830s. So the music, the parts, and sat there. Mendelssohn by the end of the 1830s was in Leipzig now, at the Gewandhaus, the orchestra there, which was really taking shape as an important part of the civic life at Leipzig. And still much in love with Bach, decided to make this Bach commemoration, a monument to Bach, which would go outside the Thomaskirche, where Bach, one of the 5 churches, but the main church in Leipzig. And decided to run a concert series to raise money for this, which included the Lobgesang, the 2nd Symphony, Hymn of Praise Symphony.
It's a great symphony.
And later on, the following, that was in June 1840, and for Palm Sunday 1841, the Matthew Passion again. So he was getting all his courage together. Let's do this again, see how it turns out.
Do we get the sense that his collection of dilettanten, as you said, or amateur singers, were as ready to perform it as, say, the Bach Choir of Bethlehem?
No.
I mean, we do Bach all the time, and so...
So this is the interesting thing about the Bach Choir of Bethlehem. So it's really happening simultaneously as what I'm describing in Germany was happening with this choir. And of course it comes from Herrenhut, so it's part of this German tradition, and it's just exported to America. So it's like a parallel tracks of what's going on in Germany is happening in America, and quite unique. Because the first performance in London, which is the first performance outside Britain outside Germany of of the Passion was in 1854.
Right.
With John, I'm about to say John Stainer. You know that name.
I do know that name.
And he was a choir boy in the performance.
Yeah.
And says how difficult it was. It was William Sterndale Bennett, who was a British composer and studied with Mendelssohn, decided that he had to bring this music to Britain. And it was the same story about how, what you were just saying about the Bach choir the first time. They took more than a year.
Yeah.
First of all, it all had to be translated into English because no one could sing in German.
Right.
And then all these singers had to go through this music was more difficult than, no one had heard any Bach. There are no recordings.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody had heard a harpsichord piece, but no one had heard anything. So that is something whatever, 1950s, to understand that before recording, you could see a score and imagine it, but that you had no idea of how something sounded.
And